Hi everyone, this is Miss Nguyen. Today's lesson is going to cover the major body cavities, aka the pockets where your organs hang out. This is a really nice picture of the cavities that we're going to go over, and then we're going to also go over some of the major subdivisions within it. So that's what this lesson is going to cover. In addition, we're going to talk a little bit about the organs found in those subdivisions or those cavities, and we're going to cover all these terms along the way. So, as we go through what a cavity is, we want to talk about the two major body cavities. So a body cavity itself, though, is a space inside your body, basically consider a big pocket that is that is allowed to be separate from other sections of your body. Now, we have two major body cavities, and within those body cavities, they have smaller subdivisions, okay? But there's only two major body cavities. There is the dorsal body cavity, which is in orange in this image over here, and it's fully encased in bone. And then you have the ventral body cavity over here, which is in red, and it's fully encased in the front of your body. Okay, these are the major body cavities. Kind of think of it as sort of a townhouse, right? So this ventral body cavity and this dorsal body cavity, there are organs within it, but they can't just kind of, there's no way for them to move over to the other side because there's this thick wall separating it, and there's kind of no doorway to lead them from one to the other, and there's no thin walls between each. It's a big, thick barrier that prevents them from meeting one another. However, within each of these, within the dorsal body cavity and within the ventral body cavity, they have smaller pockets within them, and the separation within the big body cavities themselves, they're a lot thinner. So imagine you're in a townhouse, and then you have like a curtain separating the kitchen from the living room or whatever. You have like sort of a Chinese screen separating one side of the house from one side of the living room from the other. That's sort of what the smaller cavities are separated by. So imagine those thinner separations that can be easily thrown aside, that could be easily torn, as membranes. So these membranes allow you to take these big pockets, these big body cavities, either the ventral or the dorsal body cavity, and break them down into even smaller subdivisions. All right, so membranes, thin sheets of tissues that cover and protect the organs, can also help create smaller pockets within the bigger pocket. So this is a picture of a membrane that you might find within the ventral cavity. So this is actually the ventral cavity of a pig opened up during a dissection. So in this case, you see this thin film. That is a classic membrane that is used to separate the heart region from the lung regions within the ventral cavity, within that big body cavity in the front. And that's going to help, it's actually called the pericardium, that's going to help allow the heart to stay in the same location and not accidentally drop to a different part of that big body cavity. Because again, if you look at this huge body cavity of the ventral body cavity, if it was just hollow and there was no mini membranes, no thin layers between them, then the heart, which would sit around here, wouldn't stay in place. It would actually just fall. But the membranes allow it to anchor and separate and stay in its own little location within this huge cavern. So now that we reviewed the two body cavities, dorsal versus ventral, we're going to talk about the subdivisions within them. So first, let's go over the dorsal cavity. The dorsal body cavity can also be called the dorsal cavity. However, you'll see body cavity written only for the cavities, the main two cavities, ventral body cavity or dorsal body cavity. Though sometimes people feel lazy, and instead of writing body cavity, they just say dorsal cavity or ventral cavity. They mean the same thing. But people write body in the name to go, this is the big, largest cavity that is available inside the body. Okay? All right. So within our dorsal cavity or dorsal body cavity, this is the one that's located towards the back of your body. So it's the one in orange, or posterior of your human body, and it's the one that holds your central nervous system, which means your brain and your spinal cord. Both the brain and spinal cord are really important. So not only do you have this cavity, but it actually is further, so that within the cavity itself, or not within, on the edges of the cavity, you have your bony skull surrounding the top of the dorsal cavity, and then the spinal column surrounding the pocket of the dorsal cavity that contains your spinal cord. Appropriately enough, the naming is actually very simple. So the section of the dorsal cavity that holds your brain is called the cranial cavity, right here. And the section of your dorsal cavity that holds your spine is right here. And it's called the spinal cavity, or also known as vertebral cavity, because it's inside your spinal vertebrae. Okay? So both regions merge into one another. There's no separation between your cranial cavity and your spinal cavity. They're just saying the segments. Sort of like for some people, they have a open kitchen that leads right into the living room. So you have a kitchen space, you have a living space, but there's no real division. There's no real separation between them. You just know this place is my kitchen, this place is the living room, or this place is the dining room, or whatever. Same deal. There's no separation within the dorsal cavity, but this section is a cranial cavity, this section is a spinal cavity. Some people get a little confused. Is the spinal cavity the same thing as the spinal column? So the spinal column is actually all bone, but if you look inside the bone, there's this cave inside of it, this hollow hole in the center of your spinal column, your bones, your backbone, and in that hole sits or threads your spinal cord. So your spinal cord basically weaves its way through all the bones of your back. Okay, now we've gone over the dorsal cavity. Let's go over the ventral cavity. And the ventral cavity especially has a lot of membranes and a lot of special separations within them because it's so huge. And you have so many organs in this front pocket, the ventral cavity or ventral body cavity. So it's located belly side or towards the interior or front of your body, and it contains many vital organs. If you don't know the term vital organ, it means an organ that's critical to staying alive. So your tonsils are not considered a vital organ because if you have surgery and lose your tonsils, you don't die, you stay alive. But your heart is considered a vital organ because if you lose your heart, you're dead. Okay? So that's what vital means. Now, within your ventral cavity, you have two subsections within them, two divisions. Let me try a different color. You have the division on top and the division on bottom. Okay? So, even though they're within kind of the same big pocket and it's surrounded by a rib cage and all that stuff, in this case, though, they are separated by something called a diaphragm. So you can kind of see this kind of white line. That's actually a sheet of muscle that sits right underneath your lungs, and it actually plays a really important role in helping your lungs to actually breathe. But it's sitting right underneath your lungs, and this is actually what separates between the top part, called the thoracic cavity, and the bottom section, which is called the abdominopelvic cavity, the abdomen and the pelvic region, abdominopelvic. All right. Now, all the organs that kind of sit inside your cavities, whether it's your ventral cavity or your spinal cavity, they're all soft and squishy. So we often refer to these organs as what's called viscera. So viscera or visceral organs are soft, squishy organs. Most people refer to viscera as the organs in your ventral cavity, your lungs, your heart, your liver, your intestines and stuff. If you ever heard the term to eviscerate, and you know evisceration if you play video games, the person gets stabbed and all the guts come out, it's because it's saying, hey, the guts in the front of your body are the viscera. Eviscerate is they're exiting your viscera. All right? So, all of this viscera. Okay, so let's talk about the top part of your ventral cavity, the thoracic cavity. So the thoracic cavity is your chest cavity, but it has smaller cavities within it because this chest cavity has your heart and your lungs. And your heart and your lungs are moving very quickly. And even between that, you have some other organs from your digestive system kind of weaving behind your heart and lungs in order to get to the stomach behind that. So what happens is you have these membranes making sure that the heart gets its own space and the lungs get their own space, because the heart and the lungs are constantly expanding and contracting, getting bigger and smaller, that you kind of don't want them to move out of place or bump into each other and cause issue. So in this case, each of your lungs have what's called a pleural cavity. So left or right, pleural cavity. So you have your left cavity over here and your right cavity over here. I'm pointing to this side, left and right, because remember, it's the patient's left and the patient's right. Okay? But it's the cavity that surrounds the lung. So the little membrane pocket within the bigger ventral cavity that's keeping the lungs anchored where they're supposed to be so they don't drop to the wrong location. So within the area, the space between the lungs, you have a column here called the mediastinum. So this pocket is the cavity that's the gap between the lungs where your heart can sit and where other organs like your esophagus or trachea can go through the space between the lungs. Okay? So you have esophagus and trachea are tubes, and you actually need your trachea to go to the middle of the lungs before they hook in, and you need a little gap for your esophagus to pass all the way through and down. So you have your esophagus, which is a tube that goes from your mouth all the way down to your stomach, and you need kind of a column or gap for it to reach your stomach. So the mediastinum includes all that space between the lungs. However, you can see there's a little subcircle within the mediastinum. That's just a little sub pocket for your heart, and you want to keep the heart anchored towards the front so it doesn't accidentally drop and, crush the esophagus or trachea behind it. So in that case, we're going to anchor that heart in place with another membrane called the pericardium. So the pericardium are membranes, tissues that hold the heart and then anchor it to the walls of the cavity so that it's floating towards the middle and front of your thoracic, of your chest cavity. Okay? And it also, in addition to that, provides some lubrication, some slipperiness that allows the heart to beat without sticking to anything or causing too much friction inside your chest. So, that is the pericardium. All right? So, in actuality, if you were looking at it, it kind of looks like this. So you're in between your lungs, and then there's like a kind of a separate layer of tissue between the lungs to hold the heart in place, and then it anchors to the bottom and top of your cavity. So ultimately, all these membranes that are surrounding and separating these cavities are eventually attached at some point to the edges of the ventral cavities walls, of the sides of this big pocket inside your body. So it's all kind of hooked on so it doesn't fall off. Okay, now we've already gone over the thoracic cavity. Now we're going to go to what's called the abdominal cavity. So abdominal cavity is still within the bigger pocket. And again, the abdominal cavity and the thoracic cavity are separated by just a thin muscle called the diaphragm. So it's not separated by bones. So that's why the abdominal and thoracic cavity are still part of the big ventral body cavity, because they're inside the big, tough muscle or bony pocket, and the only thing separating them is sort of a thin curtain of muscle that could theoretically be broken through with a solid object. All right? But this lower section here, abdominal pelvic cavity, houses the abdomen and pelvis. But in this case, there's not even a thin tissue separating the abdomen from the pelvis region. Not too dissimilar from the dorsal body cavity, there's not really a separation wall between either. There's no membrane between them. There's sort of just an imaginary line between the pelvic region and the abdominal region. So, like, your non-separated kitchen from the dining room. Okay, this corner is the kitchen, this corner is a dining room side. Same deal. This section is the abdomen side, this section is the pelvic side. All right, so the abdomen side is the section where most of your digestive organs sit, and the pelvic side is the section where some of your digestive organs sits, but where most of your urinary and reproductive organs sit. Okay, that's in the pelvic region, but they all kind of merge into one. So the division is called arbitrary because it's made up. That's why often when you see drawings of them, you'll see kind of a dotted line to show that it's arbitrary. This one makes it look like they're the same, but there's no tissue between the abdomen and the pelvic cavity. Okay? All right, so this is sort of the breakdown, right? We have our big dorsal body cavity with no divisions between, meaning no membranes separating the subdivisions inside the dorsal body cavity. So the subdivisions inside the dorsal body cavity are the cranial cavity and the vertebral cavity, but there's no membrane keeping the two sections. They kind of all run into each other. The front of your body is the ventral body cavity, which is completely separated from the dorsal body cavity. And within this ventral body cavity, you have the thoracic region and the abdominal pelvic region. All right, both of them are separated by a thin muscle layer, but nowhere near as thick as the dense chunks and walls of muscle and bone between the dorsal body cavity and the ventral body cavity. Okay? And again, within the abdominal pelvic cavity itself, you have two arbitrary subdivisions just to go, hey, this is a section where most of your digestive organs are, the abdominal cavity, and this is a section where most of your reproductive organs are, but there's no membrane separating the two. However, within the thoracic cavity itself, because the lungs and heart are moving so much, you want to keep them roughly in the same place because their movement is so critical for their function. You have a lot of membranes kind of separating and dividing the thoracic cavity itself into sections for your lungs called the pleural cavities, section for just your heart called the pericardium, and the area between the lungs is called the mediastinum, which happens to house the heart. So I'm going to kind of do a quick concept map so you get the idea of the body cavities and how they subdivide. So we have our big dorsal body cavity and our big ventral body cavity. Both of them roughly housed in bone, though the dorsal body cavity is fully enclosed in bone, while the ventral body cavity is only half partially enclosed in bone, but it is in its own very distinct separate section of the body compared to the dorsal body cavity. Within the dorsal body cavity, you have cranial and spinal or vertebral cavities. They don't have a division between them to separate them, so they just kind of have their own sections, but are not arbitrary, but there's no membrane separating the location for the cranial from the location for the spinal cavity. However, in the ventral body cavity, the diaphragm separates it into the thoracic and abdominal pelvic. The abdominal pelvic is further subdivided through arbitrary lines, meaning there's no membrane separating them. There's just a location for the abdomen region and the pelvic region, roughly, but there's no membrane kind of clearly dividing that space. On the other hand, for the thoracic, you have membranes breaking it into the pleural and mediastinum, and within the mediastinum itself, you have a pericardium within it that is also separated from the rest of the mediastinum through its own unique membrane separation. So, those are all the body cavities, okay? In our notes, we learned about all the cavity regions in the body that are used to kind of hold and protect and separate the organs from one location to the next. You have two major body cavities, the ventral and dorsal body cavity. By the way, I didn't really go over too much in the importance, but keep in mind, the ventral body cavity has all these organs that can potentially hold dangerous infectants, like your abdomen and your guts your digestive system are holding bacteria, your lungs are taking in outside air. So it's kind of important that it's in its own unique pocket, completely separated and quarantined from the cranial cavity and spinal cavity that have your really critical brain and spine, which you definitely don't want to get infected, okay? So you have those two big body cavities that are completely separated, and then they have within them softer separations to help anchor the organs that are found within them. Those softer separations are often maintained by membranes that help separate the organs and anchor them, which is especially critical in the ventral cavity, since the ventral cavity is so big and you want to keep those organs roughly where they should be. That concludes the lesson. Move on to any other work you've got. Bye.